Got it, got it.
Hello, friends. Welcome to another edition of Oh for Dying Out Loud. I'm so excited to have with me today.
Laura Shaw, your certified end-of-life doula.
Lovely. And I am your infamous host, Angie Katz. I'm your magical life midwife, and we are talking about death, dying, living, and everything in between. And so this is our third podcast episode. Very excited about that. And we're gonna go deep today.
Yeah.
So I would encourage you to have your toilet paper or your tissues handy. We're gonna talk about grief.
Mhm.
Grief. And as you know, my dear friend, it's a little near for me. So
Yep.
yeah, a little bit near for me. But yeah, how would you like to start off this really big topic?
Well, I guess if I'm going to start off a conversation about grief, I warn people that it could be triggering,
Okay.
and B, tissues are always encouraged, and if you cry, I cry, so let's all cry together.
Yes.
And to remind people that grief comes in all shapes and sizes. There's no rules about how something will impact you or when you'll get over it, or there's no timeline. It can be a straight line for some people. It can be a straight line that goes way up and then way down. There can be
Yeah.
lots of ups and downs. Like it's just, there's no magic roadmap
Oh,
for.
yeah. Yeah, totally. And just as a review, because this has just recently come up for me as well, I think we forget there are 5 stages of grief. And like you said, they are not linear. You can be experiencing all of them at once. You could be experiencing one, and then you go to another one, and then you go to a third one, and then you come back to the first one. I have been discovering this recently. It's like all of a sudden I'm like really irritated to admit that, but I'm like, why am I so irritated? Is that the menopause talking? And really, it could be, but it's also likely due to the fact that there's grief underneath there that I keep forgetting about because we get going through our lives, or at least I have been. Just you get up and you put on your shoes and you do your thing, and you think you just stop thinking about it for a little bit, and so you sort of get the impression that you're over it, and then something happens. Like I was practicing music Sunday evening on my living room floor, and I happened to look up and see all of my cat's nose prints on the patio door. So of course that just triggered me, and so I just had a crying fit. And so, yeah, it's interesting how those things just kind of sometimes creep up on you. But again, like you said, it's different for everybody. So what are the 5 stages? We've already talked about anger.
Yeah, so denial. Let me think about this. It's been a minute since my college psychology 101 class, but it is, and you'd think I'd remember all these. So let me just Google.
It's okay.
I would encourage everybody to do. I'm Googling right now. And it's denial, anger, bargaining, which that's a whole other topic.
Right.
Depression and acceptance.
Gotcha.
But I think that people maybe assume that it's, like you said, linear, which it is not, and that once you're beyond one piece, you're not going to go back there. But that's not
Yeah.
true either.
No, that isn't. That will hit you upside the head when you least expect it. Yeah, for sure.
And I would actually add guilt into that. So
Really?
yeah,
Okay.
and so in my experience as a death doula, as I've experienced people losing someone that they loved, there is often a sense of relief.
Really?
Yeah, so if you've
Sure.
had someone who's been in a lot of pain or it's been a really prolonged end of life,
Sure.
there can be a sense of just relief and peace that they are out of pain, that their life's burden is over. Not that they were a burden to you, although they may have been. There's no judgment for that.
Right.
And then afterwards, they feel guilty for feeling that relief.
I can see that.
Yeah.
I can absolutely see that. I mean, particularly when we talk about caregiver burnout, I mean, that feeds into this quite a bit, is that particularly if you've got someone, like you said, who has a long-standing illness, one that requires a lot of care, and particularly if that person is in the home. I have friends that have parents who are at home right now and they're dealing with dementia, and the parents are living with them now. And so when you're dealing with that for a long period of time, I can absolutely understand why when that transition finally happens, it's kind of like almost a little bit like when your child goes away to college, right? Like you grieve a little bit, my baby's gone away, but then there's a part of you that's like, oh, thank heavens, they're out of the house. So yeah, that's interesting. I would say that makes sense, guilt.
Yeah. So I do. I always had a little bit of grief, especially like I said, if it's been a long illness. And I think it's important for people to respect that feeling and not, therapists and counselors, I believe, often say, I've been to many, just don't judge your feeling. You feel what you feel. And
Right.
so
Right.
I think that is, I think that that's something that we don't allow ourselves to do. The other piece of guilt I think sometimes people feel is because they're not feeling grief in a way other people, if you've ever met that person who, I had a friend who lit up a room. She was amazing. And when her life ended, I was a mess. And I
Yeah.
remember being at the funeral and like, I was just in pieces in a way that no one in her family seemed to be. I assume they were all medicated in a better way than me. But there's no expectation. Like
Right.
it hits everybody differently. And
Sure.
maybe you grieve harder for your cat or a dog than you do your elderly parent who lived to be 95 and had a lot of underlying health issues that made the last 15 years really miserable. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So,
Yeah, there's a lot of things that factor into that. It's so funny you mentioned that because I remember distinctly when I was 16, my dad's father had passed, and admittedly, we had lived many states away and didn't get to see those grandparents as often as my other grandparents. And so I remember when that phone call came through. And for those of you back out there in the internet's land, in the interwebs, that's when we had phones that were attached to the wall. And my mom picked up the phone. She started crying. My dad started crying. My younger sibling started crying. I was the only one who did not cry. And number one, I had this really, like, I knew it was sad. It was really sad to see the rest of my family grieving in that way. But on a deep, visceral level, I sort of knew at that point in time that this isn't it. So I just kept my mouth shut and I went to my room, and my mom, God bless her, she came up and she said, "It's okay if you don't cry. It's totally okay." And so that was my first experience with, yeah, there's going to be times where I'm not going to grieve. And to your point, I mean, I lost my last living grandparent, my grandfather, who I was admittedly the closest to. And then a week later, lost my beloved 18-year-old cat. And yes, I grieved much harder, am still grieving much harder for my beloved Toby than I did my grandfather. But it was okay. Like I understood it. Toby slept with me every single night, for 18 years, whereas I didn't see my grandfather as much. And yes, we had a close relationship, but, I grieved and I cried and I had my, gosh, this is a chapter that's done. But it is interesting to watch how that lands differently, depending on who it is, the relation of that person or pet to you. And just, I think there's just so many things in there. I do want, so I agree with you on that. I do want to go back and, talk a little bit about going back to the stages, like I get anger, I get sadness or depression, denial, maybe, bargaining, don't know about that one. Talk to me a little bit about those two.
Yeah, so I think probably people could recognize this more often if it was a child,
Oh, sure.
or if a family member had an illness. I can distinctly remember. So one of my beautiful children is a type 1 diabetic, and it's kind of that idea that when they called me and they're like, I'm at work, and they're like, okay, something's not right, we think, and
Yeah.
we need to do more tests, and she's going to have to go to the hospital. And I remember like being on the back stoop of the office building that I was at with my coworker, and I'm just like, well, this isn't true. And I could do that, but why would she have to, like, why does she have to, like, let's swap, like, could we swap?
Yeah.
So I think, or if a person, when they first get, you also see this a lot in the world of hospice and doulas, but also when a person is diagnosed with a terminal illness, it's that bargaining, like, well, what if I quit smoking now? Or
Right. Right.
like, I'm not that old, or I didn't do, like, look at my
Mhm.
sibling who did drugs and they're just fine, like,
Right,
why
right.
me?
Yeah.
So probably it's more on those ends. When someone dies, I suppose you see it probably more in an unexpected death or a young death.
Right. That
Like,
makes sense.
again, if there was a car accident, no, not mine. It has to
Right.
be somebody else's kid or somebody else's
Right.
husband,
Yeah.
wife, whatever. So
Yeah. Now,
bargaining
bargaining.
probably goes that way. Mhm.
Yeah, I could see that. And from what you're talking about too, it seems like bargaining is a stage of grief, because this is another thing that I think people don't realize. We start that grieving process before they're gone,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so there's that bargaining piece that we do, like you said, maybe the person who is in hospice is bargaining, well, what if I just quit smoking? But we do it too, right? Like, well, what if we just give them this drug? And what if we just, give them they just need yogurt. They just need to be fed. They just need this. And what if we did this procedure? I did the same thing with my cat, for crying out loud, right? Like,
Mhm.
he quit eating for 5 days. Pretty clear sign he was ready to go. An interesting side note, for about 2 to 3 weeks prior to that, every once in a while out of the corner of my eye, I could see his brother, another cat that I'd had, out of the corner of my eye, and I would catch it and I'm like, and then I just knew, Cinnamon's coming to get Toby, so, but I bargained with that. I was like, I spent hundreds of dollars on food trying to figure out, well, maybe it's just the wrong kind of food. And maybe people had said, well, maybe you give him some fluids and you give him an appetite stimulant and this kind of thing. And there was a priest of me that was like, well, maybe, but I knew that wasn't the best for him. But so there's all of that bargaining that goes into it. And then when you finally get through it, particularly with a pet, because you're playing God, essentially, you're making that decision. Although there are some situations where, person's on life support, having to make that decision of when to turn that off, right? So I struggled, and still a little bit. I have talked to several people, several mediums that I go to that are really, 2 mediums that I go to that were really helpful, because I needed some validation, because I had such guilt around taking my beloved cat to the vet and doing the procedure to help him cross over. Like, it was just like, oh my God, maybe he wasn't ready. And, and it's the same, I can imagine it's the same thing with our loved ones. Like, we're guilty about, we didn't do enough. Are we taking care of them enough? Did we say enough? I mean, all of that. And so then we do the bargaining piece, to try and get through that. And I suppose the denial too. I mean, I think the denial, like you said, it seems like that would be more along the lines of a younger death, a terminal illness, that kind of thing.
Right. I think I think too, it's always, or it can be really true with people who, like, if you ever hear someone say something where, so and so has lung cancer, well, he didn't smoke, did he? And it's like, no, he never smoked. There's like this, like we start this whole narrative in our heads around, well, no, that can't be true. When it's that, I think that denial, whether it's called denial or not, I think that that's just, I think it's just part of what we do.
Yeah. I wonder if that stems from just the overarching denial we have about death, right? Like, think
Yeah.
about it. Our whole culture is, nope, I'm not going to die. I'm going to eat the right foods, and I'm going to have the anti-aging supplements, and I'm going to do the anti-aging stuff to my face. I mean, we just deny that it's coming. And we just can't wrap our heads around the fact that there are inexplicable things that happen, like somebody who gets cancer who has been healthy their whole lives or has never smoked and they got, you know what I mean? So we just can't wrap our heads around the fact that we are meant to be here for a short period of time. We are all going to go, and we do not know how we're going to go. And there is no real control over that.
Yes.
None.
Yeah. I think, so as I've gotten older, and the more deaths that I have been associated with or a part of, I'm not murdering people. So when I say a part of, I'm not the one. I'm not the impetus.
Thank you for that
Right.
disclaimer.
I know I'm not murdering people.
Yes.
But I have found it true that deaths hit me differently. People, so the first love of my life, bad relationship, but I have my beautiful oldest daughter came out of it. And I had not spoken to her bio dad for 20 years or more. And he died relatively recently. And I was so shocked by the amount of grief that I had for that. And that I was so surprised that other people were expressed like they didn't have that same feeling.
Right.
Not out of judgment, but just like, because I was so surprised by my own reaction for someone I hadn't spoken to in 20 years or better.
Right.
And I think that as I've gotten older, I have noticed that the people who have not necessarily still been in my life, but maybe who I have this great memory of, or even not a great memory, but just I had this, that I knew, just knowing a person exists in the world is so much different. And maybe it's because I'm closer to death, although who could have known that? I mean, we can die at any time. But something about death now, when I hear of it, the grief hits me differently. Not in a, I don't have to weep openly all the time, or, and I don't get in a real funk. However, it'll surprise me sometimes, like, gosh, this person was alive and I didn't speak to them for 20 years and suddenly I'm sad they're not going to be here anymore, or they're not here anymore. And so I think it is acceptable for all of us to just, probably every person in the world needs to really be prepared in whatever little way you can be for the unexpected grief that might come, like you said, from one place as opposed to another place. Like, maybe
we think we know what it looks like. We all the planning in the world, and we think we know it, how we're going to navigate through it, or how it's going to feel, and I mean, it is there's really, it's like you prepare yourself emotionally for that, but it's really preparing yourself for the fact that you don't know how it's going to show up, and I think this kind of feeds into, and I don't want to get into too much of a tangent, but I really do feel like this is also feeds into that tangent of mental well-being. We have in our culture, number one, we don't talk about it enough, and we don't normalize it enough. And so, when somebody else is grieving, we don't have a lot of, no, we have the 5 steps, we have the 5 stages, but we don't have a lot of vernacular or experience with it to know that
Mhm.
it's going to show up in a lot of different ways, you know, and, you know, like I have family members that, quite angry. And I'm sure it's because of you know, the tenuousness of that relationship, the deceased. And it shocked me, you know, because quite frankly, I just thought they were being an asshole about the whole thing. But they're not. That's part of the grief process. And we forget that because we don't know what that looks like.
Right.
And, you know, and then on the other side of the thing, you know, I mean, I have had other grandparents that have passed, and yes, it was sad, but I didn't grieve as much as I thought I would.
Mhm.
And then another example, I had a girlfriend just this past year. She had battled, she was younger than I, and she was a yoga student of mine. And she had come up through the ranks. She was an intern at our yoga studio, and she became a very well-known yoga teacher, just a beautiful, upstanding woman. And she had battled breast cancer for several years, and she, you know, had gone through chemotherapy. And I thought, this girl's strong, she's healthy, she's going to kick this. Well, it came back with vengeance, and ultimately she passed from it. And I didn't know because I had not been in touch with her for some years. I had not followed her. I mean, you know, Facebook feeds, I mean, it gets lost, right? I hadn't seen it. And I came back from some trip or something and happened to go through my feed. And here was this post about her passing. And it was like a gut punch. And I just lost it. And again, to your point, I'm like, wow. And that's where I think it's beautiful because we think, yeah, they, you know, in this instance, loved her, everything about her. In your instance, maybe didn't have the best experience, right? But they have an imprint on our lives.
Mhm.
And for better or for worse, that imprint is kind of this lovely testament to life
Mhm.
and the people that cross our paths and the things that they give us, the things that they leave, the challenges that they've encouraged us to grow through, you know, I mean, yeah, it's a beautiful kind of kaleidoscope of
Yeah.
things that converge when it comes to grief.
Well, and recently we had a conversations and coffee with death a while back. We have one coming up.
Yes, you do.
And yeah, and um something that I saw a lot in that audience was just raw grief from people who lost a loved one maybe decades ago, and they just couldn't fight. But another kind of theme that ran through all of them is it seemed to be that they weren't allowed to talk about that grief or to feel like people expected them to have some sort of a, okay, you grieved long enough, boom, you're done. And that's
Right.
that.
Right.
And I think that if people can, so first of all, I advocate strongly for support groups for grief.
Totally.
There's
Yep.
suicide support groups, there's people who've lost children, there's just support groups everywhere. I encourage those. If you come to a place like our conversations with death, another form of a support group, go to a counselor, whatever. I think that that's really important. However, I was really struck by the number of people who it seemed like they constantly said, you know, my family and friends are tired of me talking about it. Or and I understand that you don't want the person you love to be enveloped
Right.
in
Right.
sadness and
Right.
but you still need to allow for that grief to like whatever it looks like. If that
Right.
means that every third Thursday a song comes on the radio and you
Yeah.
cry, or you have to
Right.
go do something lovely in their honor, or
Right.
yeah, I
Yeah.
just think that that's something that was a theme.
I
And
noticed that too.
yeah, and I
Yeah.
don't think that we in in this country at least, and maybe this is universal,
Mhm,
I don't think that we have done a good service to our family and loved ones and friends, alive and dead,
mhm.
in allowing people to have like their own path and their own
Mhm.
existence, which is why I always say, like, if it's overwhelming for your family, then they need to have a safe time. Like once a month, you can talk about it or
Right,
whatever you need to do.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, or like you said, I mean, I think what's interesting to me about that, and I noticed that too, is that, wow. I mean, and it's not even that these people 10 years, 15 years later are a sobbing mess every day. That's not it.
No.
It's that they wanted to continue to talk about the person as if they are still here,
Mhm.
right? That they're still an integral part of their life. And that was the thing that I really noticed that got shut down. It was like, nope, they're not here any longer. It's almost like the family member felt like you're being delusional. They're not here. When I'm here to tell you, they absolutely are. They are
Yeah.
with you all the time. Every time you think about them, they're here. We talked about this previously about how those in the afterlife, on the other side of the veil, they give us lots of signs that they're here, and there are many, 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 many stories about that. And so I think that what is happening is that those family members are uncomfortable talking about that. That's their way of dealing with the grief, is that we're going to put them in a nice little box and we're going to put that away on a high shelf and we're never going to open it or discuss it again. So I think there's that piece, is that, we have to normalize the fact that it's not only is grief normal to feel in all its myriad emotions, but it's also quite normal to understand and believe that our loved ones are still here, that they are here in spirit form. And, for some, that's really hard to wrap their heads around. The other piece I want to say about that, though, in terms of, when family members are saying, oh, you just need to get over it. We're not talking about, like I said, we're not talking about those individuals who are just really despondent many, many years later. And in those instances, that's where a grief support group can really be helpful, or a therapist, because you have to look at, is this grief and the emotions that are coming up, is this hindering my ability to get through my daily life?
Mhm.
That's a difference. If you're just talking about them as if it's like talking about an ex-husband, an ex-coworker, oh, that friend I used to have, or what have you. I mean, why wouldn't we? We still talk about my grandparents that have been passed for many years,
Mhm.
It's like, oh, do you remember XYZ in this memory? And for some, that memory is very visceral. They're here. And so there's two different, kind of tangents on that with regards to how our family members treat that. But I agree with you. I think there needs to be a safe space. And if your family members are not, the safe space to talk to about, do absolutely find your tribe,
Right. Yes.
you
Yeah, for
know?
sure. It's an important thing to recognize that if you feel like you're a burden to your family because you're still talking about it, whether they have said it, maybe they have, or whether they haven't and you just feel it, that at least would let me know on the inside of my head that it would be okay for me to seek out a safe space, or a support group or a therapist, or
Right.
because
Mhm.
um, I think that part of dealing with grief is acceptance. Doesn't I to me, acceptance does not mean, okay, I accept it, they're dead, move on.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Acceptance means their physical being isn't here anymore. And so, whatever your other beliefs are, they will not exist in this physical realm in that body ever again. I won't be able to hold their hand or hug them or
Right.
any of the things that I could do before.
Right. Right.
And that can be a really sad, even if it's something you haven't done with them for 20 years, it can
Sure.
still be a really uh, that can be real grief. And
Yeah.
accepting that I know
Mhm.
in my head, in my logic mind, that those things are true.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that sometimes a song or a a color, a smell, whatever,
Yeah.
won't bring up those. So I think when we talk about the stages and how it's not just a linear, I
Yeah.
think that sometimes is the most surprising piece for
Right.
people,
Right.
is that, oh, well, I was over it. I was
Right.
done with it.
Right. Right.
Were you though? Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not like my beautiful friend chose to end her life, and
Mm.
probably for the first, I'm gonna guess it was at least a year and a half, I couldn't talk about it. Like,
Yeah.
I was a mess.
Yeah.
Um, it was it was a beautiful thing for me. And I did do a suicide support group, which I wholeheartedly loved.
Mhm.
The people there were amazing,
Mhm.
and therapy, and and
Yeah.
all of those things.
Yeah.
And it took me a really long time, but I have never been like, oh, I'm over that. Like,
Right.
she's dead. I'm over that. It's like,
Right.
no. Every day something will remind me, or something
Of
will come up.
course.
And some
Yeah.
days little things, some days big things, or
Right.
something will really bring it up, and it'll take me a
Right.
couple days to get back to
Right.
the, yeah. But I think that is a part of grieving that I think people either don't allow themselves,
Mhm.
or they are shocked when it happens, that it's like, well,
Mhm.
I was over that. He's been
Yeah.
dead for 10 years. It's like,
Well, but here's
"Mm,
what I think is so comical about that, right? Where, if we're expecting our loved ones to be over it, if we're expecting ourselves to be over it, here's what I think is comical about that. We are still talking about Prince. We listen to Prince's music and we venerate him as if he is still here, right? We have tribute bands to the Eagles, I mean, we listen to old music
mhm,
and nobody questions that, right?
right,
And we talk about those people at times and we reminisce. Why is it different with our loved ones?
right,
And I do think that it has to do with, it's, we all have to go through our path, and it, particularly within a family, that's what makes that harder, is that your whole family, each individual is going to go through it in a different way.
mhm,
And they're looking at it through their lens only, right? And so we have to remember that. And that's where we have to really advocate and, go and find the support that we need wherever we need it.
mhm,
Because, you know, so yes, grief support groups, maybe your family is open enough to talk about it. If they're not, that's because their grief process is such that they're not interested in continuing to talk about that, and so but the other piece of that too is that it's also an energetic thing, I think, and we have to be wary of this, is that we can't really be angry. I can't be angry at my parent who is angry about, that's the stage they're in with this grief process. They're in anger. If I'm not getting comfort from them, I could easily get resentful about that.
right,
But so two things happen. One is I've got to go and find my own tribe. But the other piece is that I've also got to set a boundary
mm,
such that if I am listening to your anger and I'm, being sort of I don't want to call it the dumping ground, but I'm kind of where all of that emotion lands, it's no different than any other caretaking. You do have the ability to set a boundary and go, I understand you're hurting, but so am I. And so I'm going to need to take a break. I'm going to, need to ask you to find some other support systems for you as well, because I can't hold your grief and mine,
right, right.
So we
Yeah.
forget that, just because and I've found this too before. It's like I tend to be kind of the rock in my family, or one of them. And so because I just, I've been able to just pull myself up by my bootstraps and do the thing. And, there's times where I realize that I'm like, no, screw it. I've got to process my own emotions. Wait a minute. I can't deal with yours. And
Right.
people will push back on that.
Mhm.
They will push back. Well, why aren't you comforting me? Why aren't you here to listen to me? Why aren't you being a good friend or a daughter or a parent? It's because I'm a human being
Right.
and I can only do so much. And
Mhm.
sometimes I can listen to it. Sometimes I can hold the space for you to process your grief. But other times I can't because I can barely hold the space for my own.
That is a really beautiful thought. It's this idea of generous intent that
Mhm.
maybe the person that is saying to you, I can't talk about that right now. Maybe what you're hearing is you need to stop talking about that, but maybe what they're really not as good at saying as you might need them to be is I can't talk about
Right.
that right now. Like
Right.
I cannot talk about that right now
Right.
because of what they have. Because you're right, many people have, you know, have
Mm.
their own versions of of grief. And I find it true in many older generations that
Mhm.
denial or compartmentalizing it and never talking about
Yes.
it it is pretty common, either because they
Yeah.
thought it was a sign of weakness or, whatever it
Yeah.
is they think.
Well, that's the whole emotional landscape. I mean, you just didn't talk about any of your emotions. If you lost
Right,
your job, you didn't talk about that. If you
right.
went through a divorce, you definitely didn't talk about that. So I think that's just kind of wrapped up into that whole emotional intelligence, which
Hmm.
wasn't even a phrase until recently, right?
Right. Yeah,
So yeah, I agree
yeah.
with you.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I think for people who are grieving, it's sometimes the grieving happens before the person dies.
Mhm.
And so the death can feel like a relief, but
Yep.
that doesn't mean that you stop grieving. It means
Right.
that maybe it'll come up in a weird way the next time you go to file your taxes.
Right.
And it's like, oh my gosh, I'm filing as a single person and I've never done that before. Or,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or maybe the grief because you didn't believe it was, it was a larger than life personality that you just didn't think would ever end.
Right.
Um, but I truly believe that we should never stop talking about the dead
Right.
or the people, which we can talk about a little bit in forgiveness later in a
Next
later
time. Yeah.
episode.
Yeah.
But I truly believe that every single person who comes into our life
Mhm.
comes into our life for a lesson. Like I just think the good, the bad, the otherwise, it is always about a lesson that I have to learn.
Right.
And sometimes they're ugly and messy. And, maybe you had a complicated relationship with that person who died, but it is still grief, no matter
Yeah.
how it looks.
Right.
And sometimes we remind ourselves in my family that people are complicated and we're
Mhm.
not just black and white. So just because this person is a constant whiner who has everything wrong and whatever, it doesn't mean that they never had a good day or you didn't have good memories or you aren't going to grieve the loss of those
Right.
phone calls
Right.
or whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah, so I think it's a big disservice that we do. It's always a disservice
Right.
if we don't talk about the people who have gone before us,
Right.
who taught us things, good, bad,
Yeah.
and otherwise,
Yeah.
and respect whatever that path looks like for the person who is
Mhm.
going through it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And to that end, as we kind of come up on the tail end of our wonderful podcast, I know, disclaimer, neither one of us are therapists,
Nope.
but we've talked a little bit about suicide support groups. We've talked a
Mhm.
little bit about grief support groups. What are some other tips, things to consider for people who are going through the grief process that can help us just navigate it a little bit better?
Yeah. So there's some amazing things that exist in the world.
Mm.
So one thing, of course, is if it's a longer death or hospice is in, they often have, while you can't typically have a relationship with that hospice caregiver,
Right.
they often have access to a grief counselor
Okay.
or a church or the funeral homes have.
Mm.
I'm actually going, one of the local funeral homes has a seminar about grief in the month of March that I'm going to go to just to see what they say. So there's lots of things like that, but also there's a way to find a legacy. So
Mm.
if that means that the person who passed loved heavy metal music,
Mm.
and you have to go to a heavy metal concert, or you start a small charity in their name where once a year you will pay for someone to take band camp, or like you can just find really little beautiful ways to kind of
Mhm.
we're big cemetery people in my family, so we go to cemeteries, not as often as I used to, but it's quite a trek to get to where my family is buried. Um, and so we do that. So there's lots of things that you can do. But the other thing is just find find your tribe, like you said. I definitely saw the people who came to our conversations and coffee with death. Um, I really felt connected and beautiful. And the most important thing I could ever say to them is, I'm so sorry for your loss, because I am still
Yeah.
sorry for their loss.
Yeah.
Even if
Yeah.
it was 20 years ago, I'm sorry that
Yeah.
happened to them.
Yeah.
So there's lots of little ways you can find to either volunteer in their name, donate in their name, you know,
Great
but
idea.
even something as simple as uh, I have my grandfather's hat, I have my great grandfather's cane, and my grandmother's name tag from she was a waitress for years, and I have her little waitress name tag.
Oh my gosh.
So even if it's just keeping those things
Yeah.
around me,
Yeah.
they're just little pieces of something that I'm able to kind of carry with me always.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a way to
yeah.
honor them, I mean, it's a way to honor that they were here on this planet and that
Yeah.
they did leave a mark,
Mhm.
and certainly if you don't want to hold on to those mementos, you don't have to. But
Right.
I love that idea of, I was sitting there thinking, oh, I absolutely could make donations to the Cedar Rapids Humane Society on, behalf of my beloved cats, that I've
Right.
lost or whatever. You could do those kinds of things, or, memorial. I love walking through parks and seeing those memorial benches that people
Yes.
put in, because they're, those individuals were really loved hiking or walking in the woods or something like that. So I just think that you're right. It's a beautiful way to honor that person's life, but
Mhm.
also as a remembrance again that they're not really gone.
Right.
They're still here, and we carry those mementos. My friends got me this beautiful, when I lost Toby, or when I helped him transition, they got me this beautiful embroidered box that was meant to be a memento box.
Oh.
And then, they bought me a little pillow that said love is all around.
Mhm.
And they gave me a candle. I mean, it was just a lovely little gift. And so in that box, I had gotten flowers from people, cards. I had some toys of his that I carried around with me for weeks after he was gone. It took me a
But
long time to not, like, it was like my whoopee. I just carried it with me everywhere, and it smelled like him. So I'd walk around and take hits off of this little bear every time I needed a little hit of happiness, So that's how I navigated through
Mhm.
that. But so, and so it was just interesting because, and this is part of that sacredness that I love, that helping people create, is that it's not just so clinical. They died, going to the funeral home, we put them in the ground, we're done. It, for me, that process was, yep, that day I held him in my arms when he left, and
Oh.
it was the best gift ever to be with him during that whole process. And then I came home and I just let myself fall apart. And there was a part of me that was like, I better gather up all his stuff. I need to somehow cleanse this place of his existence because it's hurts too much. And then I got the box. And so then I had I set up a little shrine right next to the fireplace where he used to sleep.
Yep.
And I put the box and I put his little bear and the flowers, and I would light a candle, and I would do that for a little while. And then, fairly soon, well, I wouldn't say fairly soon, but my point is that at some point you'll know. And I was like, okay, we're going to start to put some of the stuff in the box now. And then we're going to take the box and we're going to put it, in the closet on a shelf where I can see it, it's there. I can kind of, this is my little touch point or whatever, but you'll know, you know how to move through that. But for me, it was a really reverent act. Like it wasn't just like, I gotta pick up the toys, they're everywhere. It was really, I don't know how to explain it. It was like church, you just pick up this toy or this memento, and you really look at it for a moment and you hold it near your heart and you say a little prayer, what have you. That whole process can be a beautiful sacred ritual. It's not just the sacred ritual of transitioning our loved ones across the veil, across the Rainbow Bridge, or what have you. There is a sacredness that it kind of ripples out afterwards as well, and can continue. Like, we go, I grew up Catholic. They had the little alcove with all the little candles, and people would come and light a candle for their loved ones. Make it a sacred process, because that is where we start to really connect with the sacredness of life, knowing that death is not the end. It is just another aspect of life. They're just not here on this plane. They're living in that spirit plane, and it's eternal. Why not honor that? It's
yeah. I think if I had anything else to say is, I think it's really important to honor the stories, to share the stories, to honor the memories, to make sure that maybe no one else will know this special thing about Toby that I got to know, or this other person. Like, even if you don't share it with anyone else, you get to remember those memories, and that's good. It's a beautiful thing. So death doesn't erase those.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because Facebook isn't the ideal place, but it's a way for me to keep connected to lots of people that I care about. And so when my grandfather passed, and also with my grandmother to a certain extent, and Toby for sure, I created like a memorial post, and it was lots of old pictures throughout his life. I told stories about my experience with him, things that I knew about him in his life, things that I, as a child experienced. And I can't tell you how many people responded, hearted it, liked it. Oh, what a great story. Same thing with Toby. They love that. They love the story. There's so much juiciness and meaning in that story. And it's so lovely to just kind of put that out there. Even get this. So I used rover.com for pet sitting at one point. And she'd stayed over because I was gone for a week, and, took lots of pictures and everything. And so within the app, I was like, well, I don't need this app anymore. And I went to the profile. I was going to delete Toby's profile, because that's what you do. You create your pet's profile. There's a little button there where it says, if this pet has passed, it will put a little rainbow and it'll say in memoriam.
Oh, right? Beautiful.
Creepers.
Oh, before, I just want to say one other thing about that, and that is, so my beautiful golden girl Jen, she comes from an extremely large family. And when I say extremely large, like, she has like 81st
It's
cousins.
the entire state of Rhode
It's
Island, right?
ridiculous. Yeah. So I remember one of her relatives passed, and she said after she's reading the obituary, or maybe after she went to the funeral, she goes, she sounded like such a cool lady, because her experience with her was not the same as other people's.
True.
But
That's
I
true.
think what that reminds me, or even some of the beautiful stories I get to hear
Yeah.
about the one about your grandfather, I read that and it was beautiful. And I'm like, I hope that my life, when it's done,
Yeah.
I hope that people have beautiful stories.
Right. Right.
So,
Yeah. And I agree with you on that. And I also want to say for those who are watching, if you didn't have a beautiful story,
yeah,
honor that as well. However you need
absolutely.
to honor that, get your help with emotional support, but know that that's valid too.
Mhm.
Everybody has a different lens of experience. Yours is just as valid, and you'll need to find a way to not honor that necessarily, but honor the growth, the lessons, the way that you were able to navigate through that however you can. Maybe you honor the healing that is now happening for you.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's important to make note of as well.
Yes, that's a great reminder.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
oh my gosh. Well, I don't want this to be a cry fest. So
I know,
we're gonna
right?
have to
Let's just-
wrap this up, right? But thank you very much for this conversation. I'm sure we could talk about grief for quite a bit, because a lot of people want to talk about it. So next time, it might kind of bleed into this, because we're going to talk a little bit about forgiveness
Mhm, mhm.
next time, particularly as it relates to the end of life, and I have some interesting stories related to those in the afterlife with regards to forgiveness too. So thank you all for joining us. We hope you're enjoying these. Pass it on to those who you want to share this with, and be looking out for more. This Saturday, we are going to be doing another Coffee and Conversations with Death with Laura and I locally in Cedar Rapids. So check that out, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Oh for Dying Out Loud. So bye, everybody.